Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I am your temporary host, James Peter, and it's an absolute honor to be here with you today. As we step into this beautiful Saturday, I want to cover you all in a prayer filled with love. My family, may your hearts be wrapped in unshakable peace. May your homes overflow with joy and laughter, and may your lives be blessed beyond measure. May every tear be replaced with smiles, every struggle with victory, and every dream in your heart come true in ways more beautiful than you ever imagined. You are loved, you are cherished, and you are never alone. Now, my family, are you happy with my efforts? Let me know. I'm always here for you. And of course, let's take our attendance. Drop a comment with "I'm here, family," and let me know where you're watching from. I especially want to hear from my family in the USA and the Caribbean. Let me see how many of you are here today. Once that's done, let's dive straight into today's story. It was unpredictable, messy, and impossible to control. Everything his meticulously organized life was not. Yet, here he stood, watching sheets of water cascade from charcoal skies, effectively trapped at the Manhattan Botanical Conservatory, where he'd just concluded a board meeting about his foundation's newest environmental initiative. His driver had texted that traffic was gridlocked due to flooding, and the sleek Bentley wouldn't reach him for at least 40 minutes. The other board members had scattered, calling their own drivers or summoning ride shares, leaving David alone in the administrative building adjacent to the gardens. Waiting out the storm. The voice came from behind him, melodic and confident. David turned, his customary mask of cool indifference firmly in place. The woman standing in the corridor wasn't what he expected. Most women he encountered in professional settings wore power suits and practiced smiles. This one wore mud-stained jeans and carried a clipboard against her chest, like a shield. Her dark curls were piled haphazardly atop her head, wayward tendrils framing a face with striking features and skin the color of burnished mahogany, glowing with vitality despite the gloomy day. "It appears so," he replied, his voice betraying none of the odd stirring he felt. "My driver is delayed." She nodded, approaching to stand beside him at the window. "I'm Chantal Simone, head curator." She didn't offer her hand, didn't fawn or flutter her eyelashes like so many did upon recognizing him. "David Boone." "I know who you are, Mr. Boone. Your foundation's grant is funding our new sustainable irrigation system." She smiled then, and something inexplicable happened to David's chest, a tightening sensation he couldn't recall experiencing before. "Would you like a tour while you wait?" I was about to check on the new tropical specimens. They arrived yesterday. David's instinct was to refuse. He had emails to answer, calls to return. Time was money, and he had more of the latter than the former. "Unless you'd prefer to stay dry," she added, her eyes a remarkable shade of amber, dancing with amusement. "But then you'd miss the gardens at their most authentic. Rain reveals true nature." It was a challenge, subtle but unmistakable. "Lead the way, Ms. Simone." She produced a large umbrella from a stand near the door. "One is enough," she said when he reached for his own. "Conservation of resources is our specialty here." Minutes later, they stepped into the downpour beneath the shared canopy. The rain drummed against the fabric in a primal rhythm that seemed to synchronize with David's unexpectedly accelerated heartbeat. The gardens transformed in the rain. Colors deepened, leaves glistened, and the scent of earth and growing things intensified. Chantal guided him along stone pathways, her passion evident as she explained the collections. She didn't simplify the science for him, speaking instead with the assumption that he could follow her expertise. He could, and found himself engaged in a conversation about sustainable agriculture and climate adaptation that was both intellectually stimulating and strangely intimate. When they reached the tropical greenhouse, a sudden gust turned the umbrella inside out. Rain instantly drenched them both. Chantel laughed, a full, uninhibited sound that startled David nearly as much as the cold water now running down his neck and beneath his bespoke suit. "Come on." She grabbed his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the glass building 20 yards away. David couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him so naturally, without agenda or pretense. Her fingers were strong and certain around his, and he found himself running alongside her through the downpour, water splashing beneath their feet, the world reduced to this woman and the rain and the inexplicable lightness spreading through his chest. They burst through the greenhouse door, breathless and dripping. Warm, humid air enveloped them, heavy with the scent of orchids and exotic foliage. Chantel released his hand and turned to face him, pushing wet curls from her forehead. "Well, Mr. Boone," she said, eyes bright with mirth, "now you've experienced the gardens properly." David looked at her, really looked, at the water droplets clinging to her long eyelashes, trailing down the graceful curve of her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her shirt. The thin cotton, now transparent and clinging to every curve of her body, revealed the outline of delicate lace beneath and the proud swell of her breasts rising with each breath. Her skin gleamed like polished mahogany in the diffused greenhouse light, and David felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the tropical temperature. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, David Boone felt something crack open within him, like parched earth finally receiving rain after an endless drought. Desire, yes, a sudden, overwhelming wave of it, but something deeper and more profound as well. This magnificent woman, with raindrops sliding down her beautiful face and passion radiating from every pore, had somehow breached defenses he hadn't even realized were still standing. "I believe I have, Miss Simone," he replied, his voice dropping to a husky timbre that surprised even him. "And I find myself hoping this storm continues a while longer." Chantel's smile shifted, her amber eyes darkening as they registered the undisguised heat in his gaze. She didn't step back or look away. Instead, she held his stare with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Her lips parted slightly, the tip of her tongue appearing briefly to catch a raindrop at the corner of her mouth. The innocent gesture sent a jolt of electricity straight through his core. "The forecast suggests we're just at the beginning," she said, her voice softer, more intimate than before. "Some storms, Mr. Boone, have been brewing for a very long time before they finally break." The space between them seemed charged with electricity, the air heavy with more than just tropical humidity. For a moment they simply stood there, water pooling at their feet, their bodies close enough that he could detect the subtle fragrance of her skin beneath the earthy scents of the greenhouse. The tropical rain drummed rhythmically on the glass roof above them, creating a world that seemed to exist only for them, a sanctuary where time operated by different rules. David took an involuntary half-step closer, drawn by an invisible force he neither understood nor wished to resist. His hand, moving of its own accord, rose to gently brush a wet curl from her cheek. The brief contact of his fingers against her warm skin sent a tremor through his body that was both startling and exquisite. David Boone, who prided himself on always knowing his next move, who had built an empire on calculation and control, found himself completely unprepared for the wild, unfamiliar hunger rising within him, and strangely, wonderfully, that didn't terrify him at all. Chapter 2. Lingering Thoughts. 3 days had passed since the rainstorm at the conservatory, and David Boone couldn't concentrate. The quarterly projections for Boone Technology's newest software division blurred before his eyes, numbers dissolving into meaningless symbols, as his mind drifted back to amber eyes and rain-slicked skin. Mr. Boone. His executive assistant, Miranda, stood in the doorway of his office, her expression one of carefully masked concern. Is everything all right? The board is waiting in the conference room. David glanced at his watch, surprised to discover he was 10 minutes late for his own meeting, something that had never happened in the 15 years since he'd founded the company. Yes, fine, he said, rising abruptly and straightening his tie. I'll be right there. As he followed Miranda down the hallway of his sleek Manhattan high-rise, David struggled to assemble his thoughts. Something had fundamentally shifted inside him since that afternoon in the greenhouse. The sensation was foreign, uncomfortable, and yet he found himself craving more of it. The board meeting proceeded efficiently, as always. David had built his empire on his ability to focus, to separate emotion from decision-making. Today, however, even as he guided the discussion on market expansion and fielded questions about their upcoming acquisition strategy, part of his mind remained in that greenhouse, with raindrops drumming on glass and Chantal Simone's knowing smile. Later, alone in his office as dusk settled over the city skyline, David found himself opening his laptop and searching for the Manhattan Botanical Conservatory's website. The Our Team page featured a small photo of Chantal beside her impressive credentials: PhD from Cornell, published research on climate-adaptable agriculture, awards for conservation work. Before he could talk himself out of it, David reached for his phone and dialed the number he'd memorized from the board documents. Ms. Simone, this is David Boone. He kept his voice carefully neutral. I was wondering if you might be available to discuss the progress of the irrigation project. Perhaps over dinner tomorrow evening. The pause on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to make him question his impulsivity. Mr. Boone, she finally replied, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. I typically submit monthly progress reports to your foundation. Is there something specific about the project that concerns you? She was calling his bluff, and David found himself smiling. Another unfamiliar sensation in his professional dealings. Nothing concerning, no. I simply found our discussion the other day enlightening. I'd like to continue it. Another pause, shorter this time. Enlightening, she repeated, the word carrying a weight he couldn't quite interpret. I suppose I could clear my schedule. Though I should warn you, Mr. Boone, I'm much more interested in conservation than small talk. As am I, Miss Simone. Shall we say 7 o'clock? I can send a car. I'll meet you there, she interrupted smoothly. Text me the address and I'll arrive on my own terms. After she disconnected, David sat motionless, phone still in hand. In his world of yes-men and sycophants, Chantal Simone's independence was both refreshing and challenging. She would not be impressed by his wealth or power. He would need to offer something else entirely to capture her interest. The thought should have deterred him. Instead, David found himself more intrigued than ever. The restaurant he'd chosen was not his usual haunt. No Michelin stars or exclusive clientele. Instead, he'd selected a small Senegalese place in Harlem, known for its authentic cuisine and sustainability practices. He'd arrived early, requesting a quiet corner table, away from the windows, uncertain why he felt the need for privacy, but unwilling to examine the impulse too closely. When Chantal entered, conversation in the restaurant momentarily ceased. She wore a simple wrap dress in a deep burgundy that complemented her complexion, her hair arranged in an elegant updo that exposed the graceful line of her neck. Several men turned to watch her progress through the room, and David felt an unfamiliar surge of possessiveness. This is a surprise, she said as she took her seat across from him. I expected the kind of place that requires 3 forms of ID and a credit check before they'll hand you a menu. Her directness caught him off guard, as it had in the greenhouse. Would you have preferred that? Not at all. But it makes me wonder why a man who could dine anywhere in the city would choose this particular spot. Perhaps I'm not the man you assume I am, Miss Simone. Her eyes, warm and perceptive, studied him with unnerving intensity. Perhaps not. But in my experience, billionaires rarely deviate from type. And what type would that be? The kind who believes everything and everyone has a price. The server's arrival spared him from responding immediately. When they were alone again, David leaned forward, dropping the polished facade he typically maintained. I chose this restaurant because they source ingredients from community gardens in Harlem and the Bronx, including the educational garden your conservatory helped establish at PS 27. He held her gaze. I do my research, Ms. Simone, on all my investments. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, certainly, but perhaps a hint of appreciation as well. Is that what I am to you? An investment? I don't know what you are to me, David admitted, the honesty of his response surprising even himself. I only know that I haven't been able to think clearly since we met. Chantel's hand stilled around her water glass, her composure momentarily disrupted. Then her lips curved into a smile that transformed her face and sent heat coursing through David's veins. Well, Mr. Boone, she said, picking up her menu, that might be the first completely truthful thing a wealthy man has ever said to me. The evening unfolded with unexpected ease. Their conversation roamed from environmental policy to literature, from technological innovation to philosophy. David discovered that Chantel had grown up in New Orleans, the daughter of a jazz musician and a biology professor. She'd worked her way through college and graduate school, turning down more lucrative positions in the private sector to pursue her passion for conservation. You could have made 10 times your current salary working for Monsanto or DuPont, David observed as they shared a dessert of honey-drizzled plantains. Why choose the non-profit path? Chantel's expression grew contemplative. My grandmother had a saying, what you love, you protect. What you protect flourishes. She met his eyes. I believe the most valuable things in this world aren't meant to be commodified or exploited. They're meant to be cherished and preserved. David felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, recognizing the implicit challenge they represented to everything his business empire stood for. Success, in his world, was measured by acquisition and control. Chantel operated under an entirely different value system. And what about you, Mr. Boone? She asked, tilting her head slightly. What do you love enough to protect? The question caught him unprepared. In 42 years, no one had ever asked David Boone what he loved. They asked about his portfolio, his expansion plans, his next acquisition target. Never about love. I don't know, he answered honestly. I'm not sure I've ever loved anything that deeply. Instead of the pity or judgment he expected, Chantel's expression softened with understanding. Then perhaps you haven't yet found something worthy of that level of devotion. As the evening drew to a close, David insisted on seeing her safely to her door, despite her protests. The taxi ride to her Morningside Heights apartment building was filled with a charged silence, both of them aware of the crossroads they'd reached. Outside her building, raindrops began to fall, a gentle patter that seemed to echo the rhythm of David's accelerated heartbeat. Chantel turned to him with a smile that held both invitation and challenge. It seems we're destined to end up in the rain together, Mr. Boone. David stepped closer, drawn by the same irresistible pull he'd felt in the greenhouse. David, he said softly. My name is David. David, she repeated, his name on her lips sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cool rain, now falling more steadily around them. He reached for her slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. She didn't. Instead, she tilted her face up to his, rain collecting on her eyelashes and the curve of her lips. When he finally lowered his mouth to hers, the contact was electric, a surge of sensation that stole his breath and ignited a hunger he'd never experienced before. Her lips were soft but insistent, meeting his with equal passion. The kiss deepened, grew demanding. his hands sliding up to cradle her face as hers gripped the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. Rain soaked them both, but neither noticed or cared, lost in the discovery of each other. When they finally parted, breathless and rain-drenched, David rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to completely break the connection. "I'd like to see you again," he murmured, his voice rough with desire. "Tomorrow?" Chantel smiled against his lips, then stepped back, creating space between them. "Not tomorrow," she said, her eyes still dark with the same hunger that coursed through him. "I don't rush into anything important, David. Call me in 3 days, if you're still interested." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing through the building's entrance and leaving David standing in the rain, tasting her on his lips and feeling, for the first time in decades, the dangerous spark of something like hope igniting in his chest. Chapter 3. Green Sanctuary. David waited exactly 3 days before calling Chantel again. Not a moment sooner, though every hour felt like an exercise in restraint. When she answered, her voice carried a warmth that traveled through the phone line straight to his core. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten our arrangement," she said, though her tone suggested she'd never doubted he would call. 3 days to the hour," David replied, glancing at his watch. "I'm nothing if not precise." Her soft laugh sent heat curling through him. "So you are? And what exactly did you have in mind for our second meeting?" The pause before the final word was deliberate, charged with meanings neither was ready to articulate. "Actually, I was hoping you might show me something most people don't get to see." "That's quite a request, Mr. Boone," she responded, her voice lowering to a register that made his pulse quicken. "I meant at the conservatory," he clarified, though the direction of his thoughts had admittedly strayed elsewhere. "Something special, something most visitors never experience." The line went quiet for a moment. "As it happens," she finally said, "we have a rare occurrence this evening. A night-blooming cereus is about to flower. They bloom once a year, sometimes less, and only for a single night. The flower opens around midnight and wilts by dawn." "Sounds perfect," David said immediately. "It's not exactly a conventional date," Chantel warned. "The greenhouse at midnight, watching a flower bloom. I think we've established that convention isn't what draws me to you, Ms. Simone." Her soft intake of breath was just audible. "The conservatory closes at 5. Come to the East Service entrance at 11:30. I'll be waiting." The Manhattan Botanical Conservatory took on an otherworldly quality at night. Moonlight filtered through the glass panels of the main greenhouse, casting dappled shadows across winding paths and creating silvery highlights on broad tropical leaves. The humid air was heavy with fragrance, sweeter somehow in the darkness. Chantel met him at the service entrance as promised, dressed in slim black pants and a flowing blue top that reminded David of tropical waters. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders tonight, a cloud of luxuriant curls he itched to run his fingers through. "Welcome to the conservatory after hours," she said softly, leading him along a path illuminated only by small solar lights embedded in the ground. "Not many people get to experience this place in the dark." "I'm beginning to appreciate that exclusivity is your specialty," David replied, falling into step beside her, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed, each contact sending sparks across his skin. She led him to a special section of the greenhouse, where a group of researchers and volunteers had gathered around a large potted plant. In the center, a single bud protruded, pale and still mostly closed. "Perfect timing," Chantel whispered, positioning them where they could observe without crowding the researchers. "It's just beginning to open." Over the next hour, they watched in hushed wonder as the bud slowly unfurled, revealing pristine white petals that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The fragrance grew steadily stronger, an intoxicating sweetness that filled the greenhouse. It's the most ephemeral beauty in our collection, Chantel explained, her voice soft with reverence. All this splendor for just a few hours, then gone until next year. Why expend so much energy on something so fleeting? David asked, genuinely curious. Chantel turned to face him, her expression thoughtful in the silvery light. Some might ask why anything beautiful needs to justify its existence, she said. But biologically speaking, it's about survival. This extravagance, the size, the scent, the pure white color that glows in moonlight, it's all to attract the one specific pollinator this plant needs. It's putting everything into this one night, this one chance at continuation. A rather high-stakes strategy, David observed, finding himself moved by the plant's desperate display. Nature doesn't fear risk the way humans do, Chantel replied. Sometimes the most magnificent outcomes require the greatest vulnerabilities. Their eyes met in the moonlight-dappled darkness, and David felt the weight of her words settle between them like a challenge. This woman saw through his careful facades and calculated decisions to the risk-averse core he'd built his life around. Since his tumultuous childhood and his early business failures, David had constructed an existence defined by control and certainty. Chantel seemed to be asking if he was capable of anything more. As the crowd of researchers thinned, moving to other specimens that would respond to the night's energy, David and Chantel found themselves alone before the magnificent bloom. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the flower. Chantel nodded, and David stepped closer, inhaling the intoxicating fragrance. The petals seemed to pulse with life, their edges delicately serrated like fine lace. He understood suddenly why humans had always been drawn to beauty that wouldn't last. It demanded presence, complete attention to the moment before it vanished forever. When he turned back to Chantel, she was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Moonlight played across her features, highlighting the elegant architecture of her cheekbones, the fullness of her lips, the intelligent depth of her eyes. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said, his voice lower than intended. "It's extraordinary." "You surprise me, David Boone," she replied, stepping closer. "I didn't expect a tech magnate to appreciate something he couldn't acquire or control." "I'm learning that the most valuable experiences might be the ones that can't be possessed," he said, reaching out to brush his fingers along her cheek, unable to resist the pull any longer. "Only experienced. Only remembered." Her skin was warm beneath his touch, alive with an energy that seemed to transfer to his own body. Chantel closed her eyes briefly, then looked up at him with a mixture of desire and caution that made his heart race. "Be careful," she whispered. "I'm not a rare specimen you can add to your collection." "That's exactly why I'm here," David admitted, sliding his hand to cradle the back of her neck, drawing her closer. "Because you're the first thing I've encountered in decades that I couldn't predict or control. You terrify me, Chantel Simone, and I can't stay away." The kiss, when it came, was deeper and more urgent than their first. Chantel's body melted against his, her arms winding around his neck as she matched his hunger with her own. David lost himself in the taste of her, the soft sounds she made as his hands explored the curve of her waist, the small of her back, the swell of her hips. The sacred space, the moonlight, the rare bloom releasing its seductive fragrance into the air around them. Everything conspired to create a moment outside of ordinary time. Their bodies pressed closer, the thin fabrics between them suddenly too substantial, too restrictive. David's hands slid lower, lifting Chantel until she was perched on the edge of a nearby planting table, their mouths still fused in hungry exploration. "We should stop," she gasped against his lips, even as her legs wrapped around his waist, drawing him closer to her heat. Anyone could walk in. "Do you want to stop?" David asked, trailing kisses down the column of her throat, intoxicated by the taste of her skin. "No," she admitted, her fingers threading through his hair, holding him against her pulse point. But I don't mix business and pleasure, and you, David Boone, are technically my business." With visible reluctance, she unwound her legs from his waist and eased back, creating space between them, though her eyes still burned with the same desire that coursed through his veins. "This is complicated," she said, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. "Your foundation funds my work. There are ethical considerations, professional boundaries." David wanted to argue, to sweep aside such pragmatic concerns, but he respected her too much to dismiss her reservations. Instead, he reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both a concession and a promise. "Then I'll have to find a way to simplify matters," he said, his mind already calculating possibilities. "Because I don't think either of us is willing to pretend this isn't happening." Chantel's smile returned, slow and knowing. "No, I don't think we can pretend that," she agreed, lacing her fingers with his. "But whatever this is, David, it has to develop on equal ground. I won't be a billionaire's diversion." "You could never be merely a diversion," David said with absolute certainty. "You're the most real thing I've encountered in years." They stayed in the greenhouse until dawn, watching the magnificent bloom begin its inevitable decline as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the glass ceiling. Their conversation meandered through personal territories neither typically shared: childhood dreams, professional disappointments, quiet hopes for the future. They didn't kiss again, though the desire remained a palpable current between them. Instead, they established a new kind of intimacy, one built on disclosure and discovery. As they finally walked together toward the exit, the morning staff beginning to arrive for the day, Chantel turned to him with an expression that combined vulnerability and determination. "I should tell you something before this goes any further," she said. "I've been hurt before, badly, by a man who saw me as an exotic trophy to add to his collection. I won't put myself in that position again." David considered her words carefully before responding. "I can't promise I won't hurt you, Chantel. I don't have the best track record with relationships, or any track record, really. But I can promise that I see you, not as a trophy or a symbol, but as exactly who you are." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, a decision apparently made. "One step at a time, then," she said, and the smile that bloomed across her face rivaled the night-flowering Sirius in its breathtaking beauty. "Let's see where this leads." As David left the conservatory and stepped into the bright morning sunlight, he realized with startling clarity that for the first time in his carefully controlled existence, he had no idea what would happen next. And the uncertainty felt remarkably like freedom. Chapter 4. First Bloom. The invitation to the Boone Foundation's annual charity gala arrived at Chantel's office on heavy cream stationery, hand-delivered with a small box containing a single, perfectly preserved orchid, the same rare variety she'd shown David during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the conservatory. The note, handwritten in a precise masculine script, was brief but sent a shiver of anticipation through her. "The event benefits global conservation efforts. Your expertise would be invaluable, but if I'm being honest, I simply want you there. D." Chantel ran her fingers over the embossed lettering, torn between desire and apprehension. In the weeks since their moonlit encounter in the greenhouse, she and David had developed a connection that defied her expectations. Their conversations ranged from passionate debates about environmental policy to quiet exchanges about personal histories. He'd revealed glimpses of a childhood marked by instability and loss. She'd shared the challenges of navigating academia and the conservation world as a woman of color. What they hadn't done was define whatever was happening between them. Nor had they returned to the heated physical intimacy of that night with the serious Bloom, though every glance, every accidental touch vibrated with restrained desire. This invitation represented a threshold, Attending the gala meant stepping into David's world, a sphere of wealth and power that Chantel had always viewed with skepticism, if not outright distrust. After an afternoon of indecision, she called her closest friend, Maya, who arrived at her apartment with a bottle of wine and practical wisdom. "You're overthinking this," Maya said, pouring them each a generous glass. "The man is clearly besotted. Go to the party, wear something spectacular, and see if there's substance behind the attraction." "His world is so different from mine," Chantel sighed, sinking onto her couch. "You should see these people, Maya. The board members, the investors. They look at me like I'm some exotic specimen they can't quite categorize." "So, let them look," Maya replied, her tone no nonsense. "You've spent your career making powerful people uncomfortable with truths they'd rather ignore. Why stop now?" Chantel smiled despite herself. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. You're attracted to the man. He's attracted to you. Everything else is just details." After Maya left, Chantel made 2 calls, one to accept David's invitation and another to a designer friend who owed her a favor. If she was going to enter the lion's den, she would do so on her own terms, wearing her own armor. The night of the gala arrived with unseasonable warmth, the early June air heavy with the promise of summer storms. The dress Maya's friend had created was a masterpiece, emerald silk that draped like liquid over Chantel's curves, with structural elements inspired by the architectural perfection of unfurling leaves. It was both elegant and unmistakably botanical, a perfect bridge between Chantel's world and the high society event she was about to enter. The car David sent, despite her protests that she could take a taxi, delivered her to the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur, transformed for the evening into a lush indoor garden. Living walls covered the normally stark spaces, and carefully arranged floral displays created the illusion of a cultivated wilderness. Chantel felt eyes on her as she entered, conversations pausing as gazes tracked her progress through the room. She held her head high, refusing to be intimidated. She'd earned her place here professionally, if nothing else. She spotted David immediately. Even in a room filled with powerful men in bespoke tuxedos, he stood apart, an effect of his height, the confident set of his shoulders, and the intensity of focus he brought to every conversation. She studied him for a moment, noting the perfect tailoring of his jacket, the subtle glint of his platinum cufflinks, the controlled precision of his gestures as he spoke to an elderly couple. Then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up. Their eyes locked across the crowded room, and Chantel felt the impact like a physical force. David's expression transformed, the polite social mask replaced by something raw and hungry. He excused himself from his conversation and moved toward her with purpose, parting the crowd without ever taking his eyes from hers. "You came," he said when he reached her, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "I said I would," she replied, working to keep her tone light despite the acceleration of her pulse. "You're magnificent," he said simply, his gaze traveling the length of her body with undisguised appreciation. Chantel felt heat rising to her cheeks. "The dress is a one-off design, sustainable materials inspired by—" "Not the dress," David interrupted, his eyes finding hers again. "You. You're magnificent. The dress is merely lucky to adorn you." Before Chantel could formulate a response to such naked admiration, they were joined by an elegantly dressed couple, the woman's assessing gaze taking in Chantel's appearance with practiced nonchalance. "David, darling," the woman purred, air-kissing his cheek before turning her attention to Chantel. "And who is your lovely friend?" "Victoria," David replied, his hand coming to rest possessively at the small of Chantel's back. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Chantel Simone, head curator of the Manhattan Botanical Conservatory and the leading expert on climate-adaptable conservation in the Northeast. The emphasis he placed on her credentials was subtle but unmistakable, a clear message that she was to be respected for her achievements rather than merely tolerated as his guest. Victoria's perfectly maintained smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How fascinating," she said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "I don't believe I've seen you at these events before." "No, you wouldn't have," Chantel agreed pleasantly. "I typically spend my evenings with plants. They're less prone to asking obvious questions." David's hand pressed more firmly against her back, whether in warning or appreciation, she couldn't tell. The calculated coolness in Victoria's eyes suggested this was someone from David's past, or perhaps his present social circle, who wasn't accustomed to direct speech. "Chantel's work is revolutionizing how we approach conservation in urban environments," David said smoothly, diffusing the tension. The Boone Foundation's newest initiative was largely shaped by her research. The conversation proceeded with superficial pleasantries, but Chantel remained aware of the undercurrents, the possessive glint in Victoria's gaze when she looked at David, the speculative assessment of other attendees who noted his attentiveness, the subtle ways power and status were communicated in this rarefied environment. Throughout the evening, David remained close, introducing her to key donors and board members, his hand rarely leaving the small of her back. Each touch, though perfectly proper, seemed to generate heat that spread through Chantel's body, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the professional facade she'd promised herself she would uphold. After the formal dinner and speeches, including David's impassioned address about the Foundation's commitment to preserving biodiversity, he guided her away from the main hall and through a discreet door that led to a small garden terrace. The space was deserted, the city lights creating a glittering backdrop against the night sky. In the distance, lightning occasionally illuminated gathering storm clouds. "I needed a moment alone with you," David admitted, his voice rough with an emotion Chantel was beginning to recognize as desire barely held in check. "You've been the only thing I could focus on all evening." Chantel turned to face him, the night air cool against her heated skin. "Victoria seemed quite focused on you as well," she observed, surprised by the edge in her own voice. "Former girlfriend?" "Former mistake," David corrected, stepping closer. "One of several I made when I thought relationships were just another form of business negotiation." "And what do you think they are now?" Chantel asked, her heart hammering as he moved into her personal space, the subtle scent of his cologne enveloping her. "I think," he said slowly, lifting a hand to trace the line of her jaw with exquisite gentleness, "they're about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are, someone who sees past your carefully constructed facades to the person underneath." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, sending arrows of sensation straight to her core. "Someone who terrifies and exhilarates you in equal measure." The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm against their skin. Neither moved to seek shelter. "David," Chantel whispered, her voice unsteady. "Tell me you feel it too," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, the rare vulnerability in his expression stealing her breath. "Tell me I'm not alone in this." Instead of answering with words, Chantel closed the remaining distance between them, her lips finding his, with a hunger that had been building since their first meeting in the rain-drenched greenhouse. The kiss was electric, consuming, a claiming of territory too long left unexplored. David's arms encircled her waist, pulling her against the hard planes of his body as the kiss deepened, their tongues meeting in a dance that mimicked a more intimate union. The rain fell harder now, soaking through the fine silk of her dress, plastering David's crisp white shirt to the muscled contours of his chest. Neither noticed or cared, lost in the storm of their own making. His hands roamed her back, her hips tangling in her now damp hair as he angled her head to deepen the kiss further. Chantel's fingers found the nape of his neck, the strong line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders beneath sodden fabric. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, the storm had fully arrived, thunder rolling overhead as rain fell in sheets around them. David's eyes were dark with desire, his controlled demeanor shattered by want. "We should go inside," he managed, though his hands remained possessively at her waist. "Or we could leave altogether," Chantel suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. "Your speeches are done. Your obligations are fulfilled." A slow smile spread across David's face, not the practiced, media-ready expression she'd seen him use all evening, but something genuine and almost boyish in its pleasure. "Are you proposing we abandon my own gala, Doctor?" "Simone?" he asked, his thumbs tracing maddening circles at her hip bones. "I'm proposing," she said, rising on tiptoe to whisper against his ear, "that there are better ways to get wet than standing in the rain." David's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the storm. His eyes, when they met hers again, held a promise that made her knees weak with anticipation. "My car is waiting," he said, his voice a low rumble that she felt more than heard. "Say the word, and we're gone." Chantel knew this was a pivotal moment. Beyond the heat and hunger of their physical connection, beyond the intellectual stimulation of their conversations, lay the question of whether she was willing to truly let this man into her life, with all the complications and vulnerabilities that entailed. The rain continued to fall around them, echoing that first afternoon when something unexpected had begun. Chantel made her decision. "Take me home, David," she said simply. "You're home." His kiss in response was swift and fierce, a sealing of promises not yet spoken but increasingly understood. Then, hand in hand, they ran through the downpour to the waiting car, leaving the gala and its carefully prescribed social interactions behind. The drive to David's penthouse passed in a haze of restrained desire. In the shadowed privacy of the car's back seat, their kisses grew increasingly urgent, hands exploring with greater boldness, though still constrained by the knowledge of the driver's presence beyond the privacy screen. By the time they reached his building, Chantel's body hummed with need, every nerve ending sensitized to David's touch. The private elevator to the penthouse provided another opportunity for exploration. David pressed her against the mirrored wall, his mouth hot against her throat as his hands gathered the damp silk of her dress, fingers tracing the bare skin of her thighs with exquisite care. Chantel gasped as his touch ventured higher, discovering the lace edge of her underwear with an appreciative growl. "I've imagined this since that first day in the rain," he confessed against her skin, his voice rough with desire. "You, wet and beautiful and in my arms." "Reality," Chantel managed as his fingers found the center of her need, stroking with deliberate pressure, "has distinct advantages over imagination." His chuckle vibrated against her throat just as the elevator doors opened to reveal his penthouse, a masterpiece of modern design with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the stormy Manhattan skyline. David lifted her into his arms without warning, carrying her through the dimly lit space to his bedroom with a certainty that suggested he'd imagined this path many times before. The room was minimalist but luxurious, dominated by an enormous bed with charcoal sheets and a wall of windows that turned the storm outside into a dramatic backdrop for what was about to unfold between them. David set Chantel on her feet beside the bed, his hands moving to the zipper of her rain-dampened dress with questioning eyes. At her nod, he slowly lowered the fastening, his breath catching audibly as the emerald silk slid from her shoulders to pool at her feet, leaving her in nothing but delicate black lace. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. Chantel, emboldened by the naked admiration in his gaze, reached for the buttons of his shirt. "Your turn," she murmured, undoing them one by one until she could push the sodden fabric from his shoulders, revealing a torso sculpted by regular workouts, lightly dusted with dark hair that narrowed to a tantalizing trail disappearing beneath his waistband. They undressed each other with deliberate slowness, each newly exposed inch of skin explored with hands and lips and reverent attention. When they were finally naked, David laid Chantel across his bed with a tenderness that contrasted with the fierce hunger in his eyes. "Tell me what you want," he said, poised above her, his body evidently ready but his control still admirably intact. "Tell me how to please you." The vulnerability in the request, from a man accustomed to power and control in all things, moved Chantel deeply. She reached up to trace the strong lines of his face, letting her touch communicate what words might fail to convey. "I want you," she said simply. "All of you. Not just the billionaire or the businessman or whatever other roles you play. I want David, the real man." Something shifted in his expression, a loosening of guards long maintained, a surrender she recognized as mirroring her own. When he lowered his body to hers, when they joined in a union that felt both inevitable and miraculous, it was with a completeness that transcended the merely physical. They moved together with increasing urgency, the storm outside providing a primal soundtrack to their passion. David's hands seemed to be everywhere at once, discovering the secrets of her body with dedicated attention. Chantel matched his fervor, her inhibitions dissolving in the face of such focused adoration. When the first peak of pleasure overtook her, his name was a cry on her lips, her body arching against his in perfect harmony. David followed her over the edge moments later, his face buried in the curve of her neck, his body shuddering with release as he whispered her name like a prayer against her skin. Afterward, they lay tangled in the storm-cooled sheets, the rain still pattering against the windows as lightning occasionally illuminated their entwined forms. David traced idle patterns on Chantel's bare shoulder, his expression thoughtful in the dimness. "What are you thinking?" she asked, propping herself on an elbow to study his face. "That I've acquired companies and properties worth billions," he replied with surprising candor. "But I've never felt the sense of rightness I feel right now, with you in my arms." The simple honesty of the statement, from a man who had built his empire on strategic calculation, touched something deep within Chantel's carefully guarded heart. She leaned down to kiss him softly, a promise and an acknowledgement of the unexpected territory they now navigated together. Outside, the storm continued its symphony, a reminder of the elemental forces that had brought them together. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, David and Chantel surrendered to the new reality they were creating, one where vulnerability was strength and control gave way to the greater power of connection. Chapter 5. Roots and Wings. The next morning, Chantel woke in David's arms, sunshine streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Over breakfast on his terrace, they shared personal histories. David revealed his childhood with an alcoholic father who'd abandoned the family, a mother who'd worked 3 jobs, and the scholarships that had been his ticket out of poverty. "So that explains it," Chantel said. "The control, the empire building. You created a world where you would never again be at the mercy of forces you couldn't manage." "And you?" David asked. "What forces shaped your approach to life?" Chantel told him about her jazz musician father and biologist mother, and how she'd learned early that as a black woman, she would always have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. When David asked about her divorce, her expression darkened. "Marcus was a corporate lawyer from a good family. When we met, he seemed to value my intelligence. Later, I realized he mostly valued the image of having a well-educated black wife, his proof of enlightenment." She looked away. "When I refused to play the exotic ornament at his firm's events, when I insisted on maintaining my own identity and career, things unraveled. The divorce was ugly. David reached across the table to take her hand. He was a fool, he said simply. Perhaps, Chantal agreed, but it taught me to be careful about blurring the lines between my personal and professional lives. She met his eyes directly. Which makes whatever this is between us complicated. David brought her hand to his lips. I don't want to be just another complication in your life, Chantal. I want to be your partner, your equal. The word partner hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. The moment was interrupted by Chantal's phone chiming with a reminder of her upcoming meeting. I have to go, she said reluctantly. David arranged for his driver to take her home to change before her appointment. At her door, their goodbye kiss threatened to evolve into something that would definitely make her late. Tonight, David asked, his forehead resting against hers. Tonight, Chantal agreed. My place this time. I want you to see where I live. That evening, David arrived at Chantal's modest Morningside Heights apartment, carrying a bottle of wine and a rare specimen of orchid. Her home was the opposite of his minimalist penthouse, warm colors, overflowing bookshelves, and plants everywhere, transforming the small space into a vibrant sanctuary. As they shared a simple meal she had prepared, David found himself more relaxed than he could remember being in years. In this intimate setting, without the trappings of his wealth and position, he felt oddly liberated, seen for himself rather than his empire. After dinner, thunder rumbled outside and rain began to patter against the windows. Another storm, David observed with a smile. It seems to be our constant companion. I've always loved thunderstorms, Chantal replied, moving to stand by the window. They remind us that there are forces in this world more powerful than human control. David came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his lips finding the sensitive spot beneath her ear. I'm beginning to appreciate the beauty in surrender. She turned in his arms, her face serious. Before this goes any further, I need you to understand something. I won't be a secret or a diversion or an exotic experience. If we do this, really do this, it has to be real. It already is, David said, cupping her face in his hands. More real than anything in my life has ever been. Their lovemaking that night was both tender and fierce, a physical manifestation of the emotional barriers falling between them. In the intimate confines of her bedroom, surrounded by evidence of her life and passions, David surrendered completely to the feelings he'd been holding at bay. With the storm as their witness, they forged a deeper connection that both exhilarated and terrified him with its intensity. I'm falling in love with you, he whispered against her skin as they lay tangled together afterward. The words, never before spoken to any woman, emerged unbidden, honest, and raw. Chantal's eyes, luminous in the darkness, searched his face. I'm falling too, she admitted. And it scares me how fast, how completely. We'll figure it out together, David promised, holding her close as the storm gradually subsided outside. Neither could have anticipated how quickly that promise would be tested. Chapter 6. Storm Warnings. The photograph appeared in the New York Post gossip section a week later. David and Chantal leaving the gala, rain-soaked and obviously intimate. The headline was both trite and inflammatory. Tech billionaire's exotic new love. Chantal first saw it when a colleague dropped the paper on her desk with raised eyebrows. The accompanying article speculated about her background, her qualifications, and not so subtly implied she had earned the conservatory's grant through means other than professional merit. Her phone began ringing immediately. First David, then the conservatory's board chair, then journalists seeking comment. She ignored them all, focusing on completing her morning tasks with mechanical precision while internally processing the implications of her private life, becoming public fodder. When David appeared at her office door shortly after lunch, his face taut with controlled anger, Chantel finally allowed her own emotions to surface. "I've had my PR team on it all morning," he said without preamble. "They've issued cease and desist letters to any publication running the photo, and we're preparing a statement that emphasizes your professional credentials and the Foundation's long-standing support of the conservatory, predating our relationship." "Our relationship," Chantel repeated, the words still strange on her tongue. "Is that what we're calling this?" David crossed the room to her desk. "What would you prefer we call it?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know I don't want it dissected in the press or defended by your PR team. This is exactly what I was afraid of, David. My work being overshadowed, my reputation questioned." "The publicity will die down," he assured her. "These news cycles are brief." "That's not the point," Chantel said, rising to pace the small office. "This isn't about bad press. It's about the fact that as a black woman in a position like mine, I don't have the luxury of scandals or distractions. Every accomplishment I've earned is already questioned. Every grant, every publication, every position. People look for reasons to attribute my success to anything but merit." David was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. "I hadn't considered that perspective," he finally acknowledged. "I'm sorry." "This isn't your fault," Chantel sighed. "It's the reality I navigate every day, but it does complicate things between us." Before David could respond, Chantel's assistant knocked, looking apologetic. "Doctor, Simone, Mrs. Harrington is here to see you. She says it's urgent." Chantel and David exchanged puzzled glances. Evelyn Harrington was the conservatory's most generous private donor, a wealthy widow who funded their educational programs. "Send her in," Chantel said, straightening her jacket and shifting immediately into professional mode. Mrs. Harrington swept in, elegantly dressed as always, her shrewd eyes taking in David's presence with obvious curiosity. "Doctor, Simone, Mr. Boone," she acknowledged with a nod. "I'm glad to find you both here. It saves me making 2 appointments." "What can we do for you, Mrs. Harrington?" Chantel asked, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected visit. "You can explain," the older woman said crisply, "why I received a call this morning from Victoria Astor Hayes, informing me that the Boone Foundation is planning to withdraw its support from the conservatory's sustainability initiatives and redirect those funds to the new development project in Westchester." Chantel's eyes shot to David, who looked equally startled. "That's the first I've heard of any such plan," he said, his expression darkening. "Victoria has no authority to make such claims." "She seemed quite confident," Mrs. Harrington observed. "She mentioned something about a conflict of interest that necessitated a reevaluation of the Foundation's commitments." Understanding dawned on Chantel with sickening clarity. Victoria, clearly threatened by David's interest in her, was making preemptive moves to undermine both their relationship and Chantel's professional standing. "Mrs. Harrington," David said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "I can assure you that the Foundation's commitment to the conservatory remains unchanged. If anything, we're exploring ways to expand our support." The wealthy donor studied them both for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I see. And the nature of your personal involvement with Dr. Simone? Does that have any bearing on these funding decisions?" Chantel felt heat rising to her face, part embarrassment, part indignation at having her professional life subjected to such scrutiny. "The Foundation's grant review process is rigorous and objective," David replied smoothly. "Dr. Simone's proposals have always been funded on merit alone, long before any personal connection existed between us." "That said," he added, meeting Chantel's eyes with quiet intensity, "I make no apologies for my relationship with one of the most brilliant minds in conservation science." Mrs. Harrington's expression softened slightly. "Well," she said after a pause, I suppose that's refreshingly forthright. I'll consider the matter clarified for now. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Though you might want to prepare for more of these conversations, my dear, she added to Chantel. The gossip circuit is nothing if not persistent. After she left, David's expression hardened. Victoria, he said, the name like flint in his mouth. I should have anticipated this. Who is she to you, really? Chantel asked, the question that had been simmering since the gala finally surfacing. Her family has connections to several board members, David explained. We dated briefly 3 years ago, a relationship that made sense on paper but had no substance in reality. She's maintained the fiction that we might eventually reconcile. His eyes met Chantel's. She's also on the committee that oversees the development project in Westchester County. Chantel stilled. The Greenbrier Acres project? The one that's planning to clear 200 acres of protected wetland? David nodded grimly. The very same. David, Chantel said slowly, you know I've been fighting against that development for months. Those wetlands are critical habitat for several endangered species. I know, he acknowledged, which is why the Foundation hasn't committed funding, despite considerable pressure from certain board members with financial interests in the project. Including Victoria, Chantel concluded, the pieces falling into place. Including Victoria, he confirmed. She's using our relationship as leverage, suggesting I'm compromised by my personal connection to you. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. So I'm being characterized as sleeping with you to secure funding for the conservatory, Chantel said bitterly, while simultaneously being blamed for influencing you against other projects. It won't work, David assured her, moving closer to take her hands. The board respects my judgment, and Victoria's tactics are transparent. But effective, Chantel pointed out. She's already planted seeds of doubt with Mrs. Harrington. How many other calls has she made? How many other donors or board members are questioning my integrity, or yours? Before David could answer, Chantel's phone rang, the conservatory's board chair again. Her shoulders slumped slightly. I have to take this. David nodded, understanding the conversation required privacy. I'll handle Victoria, he promised, his voice dropping to a register that reminded Chantel of the ruthless businessman he must be in the boardroom. This ends now. As he left her office, Chantel felt a chill of apprehension. The simple joy of falling in love had suddenly become complicated by power dynamics, public scrutiny, and professional conflicts that threatened everything she'd worked for. Answering the phone, she steeled herself for the difficult conversations ahead, wondering if what she and David were building could withstand the storm that was clearly approaching. Chapter 7. Crossroads. The boardroom of Boone Technologies fell silent as David entered. 14 pairs of eyes watched him take his place at the head of the table, his expression giving nothing away despite the turmoil of the past 24 hours. Thank you all for accommodating this emergency meeting, he said, his voice controlled and authoritative. I've called you here to address the Greenbrier Acres development project and the Foundation's position on it. Victoria Astor Hayes shifted in her seat, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping lightly against the polished table. I believe we've already discussed the Foundation's potential involvement, she said smoothly. The project presents significant economic opportunities for the region. It also presents significant environmental concerns, David countered, nodding to his assistant who distributed folders to each board member. These reports detail the ecological impact of developing those wetlands. The environmental cost far outweighs any economic benefit. With all due respect, interjected Roland Hayes, Victoria's uncle and a major shareholder, these concerns seem to have surfaced rather suddenly. One might wonder if your personal entanglements are coloring your judgment. The implied accusation hung in the air. David's expression remained impassive, though a muscle tightened in his jaw. If you're referring to my relationship with Dr. Simone, he said evenly, I would remind the board that her expertise in conservation science is precisely why her opinion on this matter should be valued. However, these reports, he tapped the folder, come from independent environmental assessment firms with no connection to Dr. Simone or the conservatory. Nevertheless, Victoria persisted, the appearance of a conflict exists. We must consider the Foundation's reputation. Indeed we must, David agreed, his tone hardening slightly, which is why I've prepared a statement clarifying that Dr. Simone and I have recused ourselves from any funding decisions that might present even the appearance of conflict. He slid another document across the table. What I will not do is support a project that violates the Foundation's core mission of environmental sustainability, simply to avoid unsubstantiated gossip. Victoria's smile tightened. How noble! And what does your new friend think of your decision to distance yourself from her professional concerns? David met her gaze directly. Doctor, Simone understands professional ethics better than most, Victoria, something you might consider emulating. The rebuke, though quietly delivered, caused several board members to shift uncomfortably. As for the Greenbrier project, David continued, addressing the room at large, I recommend the Foundation publicly withdraw consideration of funding and issue a statement supporting the preservation of the wetlands. I've outlined our environmental and ethical reasoning in the documents before you. The board discussion that followed was heated but ultimately productive. By the meeting's end, a majority had sided with David's position, impressed by the thoroughness of his environmental impact research. Victoria and her uncle departed with thinly veiled hostility, but David had won this particular battle. The victory, however, felt hollow as he drove to Chantel's apartment that evening. Their phone conversations over the past day had been brief and strained, her attention consumed by damage control at the conservatory, while his focused on countering Victoria's machinations. Rain began to fall as he parked outside her building, a gentle, steady shower that seemed to echo his own uncertainty. They had met in the rain, found each other in the rain, and now faced their first serious challenge as rain fell once again around them. David wondered if it was an omen. When Chantel opened her door, the shadows beneath her eyes told him everything about how difficult her day had been. Without words, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if she might slip away. I've missed you, he murmured against her hair. It's only been a day, she replied, though her arms tightened around him, belying her casual response. Inside her apartment, they sat close together on her small sofa, the rain pattering against the windows, creating a bubble of intimacy around them. The board meeting went as well as could be expected, David said, his fingers intertwined with hers. We're officially opposing the Greenbrier development and issuing a statement supporting wetland preservation. Relief flickered across Chantel's face. That's wonderful. Those wetlands are irreplaceable. Victoria wasn't pleased, he added. I don't think we've heard the last from her. No, I expect not. Chantel sighed, pulling her hand from his to run it through her hair, a gesture he now recognized as a sign of stress. My board wasn't quite as supportive as yours. David tensed. What happened? They're concerned about negative publicity affecting donor relationships. Some have suggested I take a temporary leave of absence until the media attention dies down. Her voice was steady, but David could hear the hurt beneath the professional facade. Apparently, I'm a distraction from the conservatory's mission. That's absurd, David said, anger flaring. You are the conservatory's mission. Without your work, half their programs wouldn't exist. It doesn't matter, Chantel replied, rising to pace the small room. Perception is reality in donor-funded organizations. If they believe I'm compromising our reputation, the facts are irrelevant. I'll speak to them, David offered immediately. I can increase the foundation's funding to offset any potential losses. No, Chantel interrupted sharply. That's exactly what we can't do, David. Using your money or influence would only confirm their suspicions that our relationship is somehow transactional. She stopped pacing to face him directly. Don't you see? This is precisely what I was afraid of when we started this. My professional credibility is being questioned because of who I'm sleeping with. The bluntness of her phrasing stung. Is that all this is to you? David asked quietly. Sleeping together? Chantel's expression softened. You know it isn't. But that's how the world sees it. The black conservationist sleeping with the white billionaire who funds her pet projects. It's a narrative I've spent my entire career trying to avoid. David stood, moving to take her hands in his. Then we changed the narrative. Together. How? Chantel asked, the vulnerability in her voice cutting him to the quick. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I do know that what we have is worth fighting for. At least, it is to me. He searched her eyes, suddenly unsure. Is it to you? The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, Chantel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I need some time, David. Space to think without your gravitational pull affecting every decision. She squeezed his hands before gently disengaging. This all happened so fast, and now the consequences are crashing down around us. It wasn't a rejection, not quite, but it felt like one. David's chest tightened with an unfamiliar panic. How much time? I don't know, she answered honestly. But I need to handle the conservatory situation on my own terms, establish boundaries that protect my professional standing. David wanted to argue, to offer solutions, to fix everything as he'd spent his life doing. Instead, he forced himself to respect her request. I understand, he said, though every instinct rebelled against walking away. At her door, their goodbye kiss was tender and tinged with uncertainty. This isn't an ending, Chantel whispered against his lips. Just a pause to find our footing. David nodded, unable to trust his voice. As he walked to his car through the gentle rain, he felt as though he was leaving part of himself behind, a vulnerability he hadn't experienced since childhood. For the first time in decades, David Boone found himself facing a problem he couldn't solve with money, power, or strategic planning. This was unfamiliar territory, and the way forward was anything but clear. Chapter 8. Weathering the Storm. 3 weeks of silence stretched David's self-control to its limits. 3 weeks of respecting Chantel's request for space, while every instinct urged him to act, to fix, to claim. He threw himself into work, logging 18-hour days that left his executive team struggling to keep pace. Meanwhile, the media storm intensified. Victoria leaked anonymous concerns about funding improprieties to several business publications. The conservatory's board placed Chantel on a month's administrative leave, ostensibly to conduct an ethics review, though no evidence of misconduct existed. David watched from a distance, maintained the separation she'd requested, but quietly collected every article, monitored every development. When the New York Times ran a particularly vicious piece questioning Chantel's qualifications, he had to physically restrain himself from calling her, from rushing to her defense. Instead, he channeled his frustration into strategic action. His legal team quietly built a defamation case against publications printing unsubstantiated claims. His PR team prepared a comprehensive dossier on Chantel's academic credentials and professional achievements. His private investigators compiled evidence of Victoria's systematic attempts to undermine Chantel's reputation. But he didn't deploy any of it. Not yet. Not without Chantel's consent. On the 23rd day of their separation, the skies opened in a summer deluge that flooded Manhattan streets and sent residents scurrying for shelter. David sat in his penthouse office, watching raindrops race down the floor-to-ceiling windows, each one reminding him of that first afternoon in the greenhouse. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Ordinarily, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something prompted him to answer. David Boone. "Mr. Boone, this is Maya Wilson, Chantel's friend." The woman's voice was crisp and direct. "I'm calling because she's too stubborn to do it herself." David's pulse quickened. "Is she all right?" "Physically, yes. Professionally and emotionally, not so much." Maya sighed audibly. "Look, I'm probably overstepping, but I can't watch her sacrifice her happiness to protect her pride any longer. The conservatory board met yesterday. They're extending her leave indefinitely pending further review." "Based on what evidence?" David demanded, anger flaring. "None. That's the point. It's a waiting game. They're hoping she'll resign to avoid further controversy. Meanwhile, she's isolating herself, refusing to let anyone help, including you." David pinched the bridge of his nose, processing this information. "What do you suggest, Ms. Wilson? I've been respecting her request for space." "Respectfully, Mr. Boone, sometimes space isn't what people actually need. Sometimes they need someone to remind them what they're fighting for." Maya's voice softened slightly. "She misses you. She won't admit it, but she does. And from what I gather, you miss her too." "More than I can express," David acknowledged, surprising himself with the raw honesty. "Then do something about it," Maya challenged. "She's at the conservatory now, cleaning out her office. Today might be your last chance before she convinces herself this separation is for the best." After thanking Maya for the call, David sat motionless for several moments, weighing his options. Respecting Chantel's boundaries was important, but so was fighting for what they'd found together. The rain continued to pour outside, echoing the tumult of his thoughts. Decision made, he grabbed his coat and keys. The Manhattan Botanical Conservatory was nearly deserted in the downpour, most visitors having sought drier attractions for the day. David bypassed the main entrance, using his foundation credentials to access the administrative building where he'd first met Chantel months earlier. He found her in her office, methodically packing books into cardboard boxes, her back to the door. Even from behind, he could see the weariness in the slope of her shoulders, the mechanical precision of her movements. "Going somewhere?" he asked softly from the doorway. Chantel froze, then slowly turned to face him. The sight of her, beautiful despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes, hit him with physical force. "David," she said, his name half statement, half question. "What are you doing here?" "Breaking the silence," he replied simply. "It's been 23 days, Chantel. I've respected your request for space, but I can't stand by and watch them dismantle your career over us." She sighed, setting down the book in her hands. "It's not just about us anymore. Once the story broke, every decision I've ever made, every grant I've ever received came under scrutiny. The board is concerned about appearances rather than facts." "Then we give them new facts," David said, stepping further into the office. "I have everything we need to fight this. Legal options, media strategy, evidence of Victoria's deliberate campaign against you." "More complications," Chantel said wearily. "More visibility, more drama. What's the alternative? Letting them win? Sacrificing your career and our relationship because it's easier than fighting?" "Easier?" Chantel's voice rose slightly. "None of this has been easy, David. I've spent years building my reputation in this field, years proving that I belong at this level based on merit alone, and in a matter of weeks it's all been reduced to whispers about who I'm sleeping with." David closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her, though his body ached to do so. "I understand that. But walking away from your work, from us, that's not the solution." "Then what is?" she challenged, vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. "We face it together," he said simply. No more separation, no more hiding, no more letting others define what we are to each other. Thunder rumbled outside, rain lashing against the windows in sheets. The weather seemed to echo the emotional tempest between them, powerful, elemental, impossible to ignore. "I've missed you," Chantel admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Every day, every hour. But I kept thinking if I just gave it time, if I just focused on salvaging my professional standing." "I've missed you too," David said, finally allowing himself to reach for her hand. "More than I knew was possible. And I've realized something in these weeks apart." "What's that?" she asked, not pulling away from his touch. "That all of this, my company, my wealth, my so-called empire, it means nothing if I can't share it with someone who sees me for who I really am." His grip tightened slightly. "You're that person, Chantel. The only one who's ever looked past the billionaire facade to the man underneath." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm scared, David. Scared of losing everything I've worked for. Scared of depending on you and your resources to fix this. Scared of what happens if we can't weather this storm." David brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you. I've never had so much to lose." The honesty of his confession, this admission of vulnerability from a man who had built his life around projecting strength and control, seemed to reach Chantel in a way his other arguments couldn't. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "First," David said, drawing her gently into his arms, "we stop pretending we're better apart than together." Chantel melted against him, her body fitting against his as perfectly as he remembered. The sensation of holding her again after weeks of separation was overwhelming, a homecoming he hadn't known he needed until this moment. "And then," she murmured against his chest. "Then we fight back," David said with quiet determination. "But on our terms, not theirs. No more reactions, no more defense. We take control of the narrative." The kiss that followed was both tender and fierce, a reconnection, a promise, a declaration. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the small office, something broken began to heal. As they broke apart, Chantel's expression had transformed, the weariness replaced by a spark of her natural determination. "You know what? You're right. I've been playing defense, trying to protect what I've built instead of standing up for it." "We both have," David acknowledged. "I've been respecting your boundaries at the expense of supporting you when you needed it most." Chantel turned to look out at the rain-lashed gardens, then back to David with newfound resolve. "I want to make a statement, a public one. No more hiding, no more separate damage control. We present a united front." David's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're sure? That's a complete reversal from your position 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago, I thought separation would protect my professional standing," Chantel replied. "Now I understand it only made me more vulnerable. They've been controlling the story because we've been silent." Her amber eyes flashed with determination. "It's time to change that." "What did you have in mind?" David asked, a smile beginning to form as he recognized the return of the passionate, fearless woman he'd fallen in love with. "A press conference," Chantel said decisively. "Here, at the conservatory. We present the evidence you've gathered about Victoria's smear campaign. We address the conflict of interest concerns directly by announcing transparent oversight protocols for foundation grants." Her mind was clearly racing ahead, formulating strategy as she spoke. "Most importantly, we refuse to apologize for our relationship while maintaining clear professional boundaries." David felt a surge of pride and admiration watching her transform from defeated to defiant. "I like it," he said. "Bold, direct, proactive, instead of reactive." "There's a condition," Chantel added, her expression serious. I want to be clear that this is my battle too. I won't be the damsel you rescue with your resources and influence. We stand as equals in this. I wouldn't have it any other way, David assured her. Your expertise, your reputation, your integrity. These are your weapons, and they're more powerful than anything my money could buy. As they left the conservatory together, stepping into the pouring rain without bothering with umbrellas, David felt the weight of the past 3 weeks lifting. They had weathered their first major storm as a couple, and though challenges certainly lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they now walked hand in hand through the downpour, embracing rather than avoiding the elements that had brought them together. The rain, David realized, had never been an obstacle to overcome. It had been a blessing, washing away pretenses and revealing what truly mattered. And now, once again, it baptized them with its cleansing power, preparing them for the battle and the future that awaited. Chapter 9. Revelation. The press conference was Chantel's idea, a bold public response to weeks of whispers and innuendo. The venue was symbolic. The main atrium of the Manhattan Botanical Conservatory, surrounded by the living testament to her professional dedication. David stood supportively at her side as she addressed the assembled journalists, her voice clear and unwavering despite the pressure. I've dedicated my career to conservation science, not tabloid headlines, Chantel stated firmly. The suggestion that my relationship with David Boone has compromised my professional ethics is not only false but reveals a disturbing pattern of prejudice. My work has always stood on its own merit. As she spoke, David studied the crowd, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Victoria slipping in through a side entrance. She hadn't been invited, yet here she was, elegant in a tailored navy suit, composed and clearly planning something disruptive. Chantel was concluding her statement when Victoria stepped forward. Dr. Simone, isn't it true that the conservatory's funding increased by 40% after you began your relationship with Mr. Boone? A murmur rippled through the assembled press. David tensed, ready to intervene, but Chantel raised a hand to stop him. That's correct, Chantel acknowledged, surprising everyone with her candor. The Boone Foundation's support did increase, 6 months before David and I ever met. The funding was based on peer-reviewed research proposals and approved by an independent committee. She fixed Victoria with a level gaze. Perhaps you'd like to explain why you attempted to pressure board members into rescinding that funding after our relationship became public. Victoria blanched visibly. I don't know what you're... We have recorded calls, Ms. Astor Hayes, David interrupted smoothly, stepping forward. Calls to board members, donors, and journalists spreading false information about Dr. Simone's qualifications and our foundation's grant process. He nodded to his assistant, who distributed folders to key journalists. You'll find documented evidence of a systematic attempt to damage Dr. Simone's reputation and undermine the conservatory's funding. Not for ethical concerns, but because Ms. Astor Hayes has personal and financial interests in the Greenbrier Development Project, a project that would destroy protected wetlands, and that Dr. Simone has professionally opposed. David continued, his voice measured but authoritative. The evidence includes emails between Ms. Astor Hayes and real estate developers promising to handle the environmental opposition, financial records showing her undisclosed 15% stake in Greenbrier Holdings, and recorded conversations with 3 conservatory board members, where she explicitly threatened to withdraw donor support if Dr. Simone remained in her position. Victoria's face contorted with fury. You wouldn't dare expose. I already have, David said quietly. The full dossier has been delivered to the Foundation Board and the SEC, given the multiple conflicts of interest you failed to disclose. Your uncle's position on the board won't protect you this time. Cameras flashed as Victoria stalked out, her perfect composure shattered. The press redirected their attention to David and Chantel, questions flying rapidly about the evidence. David raised his hands for quiet. This isn't just about clearing Dr. Simone's name, though that's certainly important to me. He turned to face Chantel, his expression softening. This is about standing beside the woman I love and refusing to let others define our relationship or her exceptional career. Chantel's eyes widened at his public declaration. They had planned to keep the focus professional. Yet here was David, abandoning script to speak from his heart before dozens of journalists. I fell in love with Chantel Simone because of her brilliance, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to protecting our natural world, David continued, his gaze never leaving hers. Anyone who knows her work understands why she's respected globally in her field. Anyone who knows her heart understands why I can't imagine my life without her. Without warning, he dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. The room erupted in gasps and camera flashes. This isn't how we planned this press conference, David acknowledged with a smile, but I've learned that the most important moments in life rarely follow a script. He opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald ring, the deep green echoing the dress she'd worn to the gala, the setting designed to resemble intertwining vines. Chantel Simone, will you marry me? Time seemed to stop as their eyes locked. In that suspended moment, the cameras, the journalists, the scandal, all fell away, leaving only the two of them, connected as they had been since that first rainy day. Yes, Chantel whispered, then louder for all to hear. Yes, I will. As David slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, the heavens opened outside. Rain poured down the glass ceiling of the atrium, surrounding them in the element that had marked every significant moment of their relationship. Cameras captured the perfect symbolism. The brilliant conservationist and the powerful businessman united beneath a downpour that seemed to bless their union, a love that had weathered its own storm and emerged stronger for the tempest. Later that evening, as they celebrated privately in David's penthouse, Chantel's phone rang with news from the conservatory board chairman. After reviewing the evidence against Victoria and witnessing the public support for Chantel at the press conference, the board had not only reinstated her, but offered her the position of executive director. Their only condition, the establishment of an independent review committee for all grant applications to ensure transparency going forward. They're promoting me, Chantel said in disbelief as she ended the call. They're recognizing your value, David corrected, pulling her into his arms. Something I've known since the day we met in the rain. Chapter 10. Full bloom. 6 months later, the Manhattan Botanical Conservatory transformed into an enchanted garden. Candlelight illuminated paths winding through lush greenery, and rare blooms opened especially for the occasion, filling the air with a heady mixture of jasmine, gardenia, and exotic orchids. In the tropical greenhouse where their story began, David waited beneath an arbor of cascading white phalaenopsis orchids and deep green monstera leaves. The intimate gathering included only their closest friends and family, a stark contrast to the public spectacle that had surrounded them since the press conference. The scandal had collapsed quickly in the face of the overwhelming evidence against Victoria. She had resigned from all board positions and retreated from public life after the SEC opened a formal investigation into her financial dealings. Meanwhile, the Greenbrier wetlands had been designated a protected sanctuary, safe from development, a victory for Chantel's first initiative as executive director. As soft strings filled the greenhouse with Debussy's Clair de Lune, David turned to see Chantel approaching on her father's arm. Her gown, a masterpiece of champagne silk with delicate embroidered leaves cascading from shoulder to hem, caught the golden light and seemed to glow from within, much like the woman herself. The warm, humid air of the greenhouse carried the scent of rain-damp earth and tropical blooms, the same scents that had surrounded them during their first encounter. Every detail had been chosen to honor not just their love story, but Chantel's lifelong commitment to the natural world. Their vows, spoken amidst the living beauty they both cherished, were both eloquent and disarmingly honest. "I promise to challenge you," Chantel said, her eyes never leaving his, "to question your certainties when necessary, to support your ambitions when worthy, and to remind you that the most precious things in life can't be acquired or controlled, only cherished and protected." "I promise to listen," David responded, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "To value your wisdom above my own assumptions, to stand beside you as an equal partner, and to remember that the greatest strength lies not in power or wealth, but in the courage to be vulnerable with the one you love." As they exchanged rings, a gentle rain began to patter against the greenhouse roof, so faint that many guests didn't notice, but unmistakable to David and Chantel. They shared a private smile at the familiar soundtrack to their love story. "I arranged for perfect weather," David whispered as he slipped the band onto her finger. "It is perfect," Chantel replied, glancing upward at the rain-misted glass dome. "Absolutely perfect." The celebratory dinner afterward was held in the conservatory's main hall, transformed into an intimate forest glade with living trees and cascading flowers. Between courses, David surprised Chantel by announcing the creation of the Simone Fellowship for Underrepresented Scientists in Conservation, a program that would fund research opportunities for women of color pursuing careers in environmental science. "My wife," he said, the new term sending a visible thrill through them both, "has shown me that true change requires not just resources, but representation. This fellowship honors her journey and ensures others will have clearer paths to follow." Later, as they shared their first dance, Chantel rested her head against David's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You keep surprising me," she murmured. "I plan to continue for at least the next 50 years, he promised, holding her closer. "Starting with our honeymoon destination, which remains a closely guarded secret." "As long as there's a chance of rain," Chantel teased, "I'm sure I'll love it." The evening concluded with a surprise orchestrated by Maya. As the newlyweds prepared to depart, the greenhouse sprinklers activated briefly, a manufactured downpour that drenched them both to delighted laughter from the guests. Soaking wet and laughing, David swept Chantel into his arms and carried her through the impromptu shower to their waiting car. "Some might consider this bad luck," he said, brushing wet curls from her face. "Not us," Chantel replied, pulling him down for a rain-sweetened kiss. "For us, it's the most perfect blessing imaginable." Chapter 11. Raindrops and Legacies. 5 years later. "Daddy, look! It's starting again." David looked up from his tablet to see his 4-year-old daughter, Aria, pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Central Park penthouse. Her small finger traced the path of raindrops racing down the glass, her dark curls, so like her mother's, bouncing with excitement. "So it is," David agreed, setting aside his work to join her at the window. "Where's your brother? He won't want to miss this." "Noah's helping Mama with the seeds," Arya informed him importantly. "They're getting them ready for the garden party." As if summoned by his sister's words, Noah came running into the room, his eyes, the same steel blue as his father's, wide with anticipation. "Is it raining hard enough yet?" he demanded, squeezing in beside his twin. "Almost," David promised, one arm around each child. "As soon as the thunder starts." A low rumble interrupted him, causing both children to squeal with delight. "That's our cue," came Chantel's voice from the doorway. She stood watching them, soil still under her fingernails from the planting project, her face alight with love for her family. Despite running both the conservatory and the Boone Simone Foundation's environmental initiatives, she never missed a rain ritual with the twins. Rain gear ready, Noah shouted, racing to the closet where their special outfits waited, tiny yellow raincoats and boots that matched their mothers. 10 minutes later, the family stood on their private rooftop garden terrace, faces tilted to the sky as warm summer rain soaked them thoroughly. The twins danced in puddles, their laughter rising above the storm's percussion. Arya, artistic and dreamy like her father had been as a child, spun with her arms outstretched, trying to catch raindrops on her tongue. Noah, methodical and observant like his mother, was carefully examining how the rain affected different plants in their garden, already showing the scientific curiosity that made Chantel beam with pride. "They're getting bigger every day," David observed, his arm around Chantel's waist as they watched their children. "How did 4 years pass so quickly?" "The same way 5 years of marriage did," Chantel replied, leaning into his embrace. "One remarkable day at a time." David turned her to face him, as captivated by her rain-jeweled eyelashes and radiant smile as he had been that first day in the greenhouse. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question a familiar check-in they'd maintained through the years. "Not one," Chantel answered truthfully, "though I'm still surprised sometimes when I wake up and find you beside me. The formidable David Boone, undone by a little rain and a lot of love." He laughed, pulling her closer. "Best undoing I could have imagined, though these two," he nodded toward the twins who were examining a puddle that had formed a perfect reflection of the stormy sky, "have completed the job quite thoroughly." Their journey to parenthood had been unexpected, the twins arriving just a year into their marriage, transforming their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The pregnancy had been difficult, with Chantel on bed rest for the final 2 months, David practically living in the hospital alongside her. The day Arya and Noah entered the world, during a spectacular thunderstorm, naturally, had been the most terrifying and exhilarating of David's life. Holding those tiny, perfect beings, he had finally understood what Chantel had tried to explain that night in the greenhouse years ago, that the most magnificent outcomes often require the greatest vulnerabilities. "What are you thinking about so intensely?" Chantel asked, brushing wet hair from his forehead. "How perfectly the universe arranged things," David replied, "how every raindrop led us exactly where we needed to be." A shriek of laughter drew their attention as the twins discovered a particularly deep puddle. Noah, always the protector despite being younger by 7 minutes, held his sister's hand to keep her steady as they splashed with wild abandon. "We should get them inside soon," Chantel said, though she made no move to end the celebration. "The garden party starts in 2 hours and we all need to dry off." The party, an annual fundraiser for the foundation held in the conservatory's expanded gardens, had become one of the most coveted invitations in Manhattan. Unlike the stuffy galas of David's past, this event celebrated environmental innovation with demonstrations, interactive exhibits, and scholarship announcements for the next generation of conservationists. 5 more minutes, David suggested, unwilling to cut short this private family moment. "Some things are more important than punctuality," says the man who once scheduled his days in 15-minute increments, Chantel teased, though she nodded in agreement. 5 more minutes. As they stood watching their children dance in the summer storm, David reflected on how completely his life had transformed since that fateful rainy day when a brilliant botanist had offered him shelter under her umbrella. His definition of success had evolved from acquisition and control to nurturing and protecting, whether that meant safeguarding endangered ecosystems through the foundation or teaching his children to respect the natural world around them. "I love you," he said simply, turning to kiss his wife as rain continued to fall around them. "More than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," Chantel replied against his lips, rain or shine, storm or calm. A peal of thunder punctuated her words, followed by excited squeals from the twins. David and Chantel broke apart laughing, then moved to join their children in their rain dance, four figures silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline, a family forged in downpours and flourishing in both storms and sunshine. Later, as they prepared for the garden party, David paused in the doorway of the twins' bedroom. Chantel sat between their beds, reading a story about a seed that grew despite impossible odds. The children, freshly bathed and pajama-clad, would join the beginning of the party before their nanny brought them home for bed. Watching his family, this miraculous gift he'd never expected to receive, David felt a fullness in his chest that defied description. From solitary billionaire to husband and father, from isolated success to connected purpose, his journey had begun with a chance encounter in the rain, and he wouldn't change a single drop of it. The end.